Well, I am today going to talk very briefly in a rather general way about the current state of affairs with respect to the ongoing research and attempted recovery and restitution of artworks that were mostly confiscated, occasionally one could only say lost, during the era of the Nazi occupation of the Western European countries, meaning the years 1933 to 45. It's a rather specific definition that comes into play in a legal sense with what does or does not constitute the Nazi era. We know that things continued to go missing after the end of most hostilities in May of 1945, but then for another 2 or 3 months throughout that summer, there were still things that had been intact earlier that ended up being in one way or another damaged, dispersed, or in fact lost. The story of Nazi-era looting and pillage is, of course, a very complicated one that began long before the declaration of war in September of 1939, when the German Luftwaffe, of course, bombed Warsaw and many other areas and cities in Poland. There then followed about 9 or 10 months of what people in Britain and France called the phony war, meaning that although war had been declared in all directions, nothing seemed to be happening on their own eastern front, or the western front of Germany, of course, because the invasion of Western Europe did not begin until the spring of 1940, when weather conditions allowed for that to be the case. So within just a few weeks, both France and then the Low Countries of the Netherlands and Belgium were, of course, completely overrun, and German Gestapo affiliates and so forth, governments were set up in all of those countries. Denmark and Norway too, very shortly thereafter. Only Sweden and Switzerland managed to remain really neutral throughout the war, although both of those countries had rather dubious parts to play in the entire story of how art got laundered through both of those countries, especially Switzerland, of course, that had come from France, Germany, or any of the other occupied territories. So the looting of art, or the loss of art, really did begin, first of all, in Germany itself. But before that, I want to just kind of remind you of 2 or 3 circumstances or 2 or 3 situations that pertained at the time that war broke out, which means that even though there are certain artists and work by certain artists that we automatically think of as being associated with Nazi-era pillaging and looting, in fact, in many cases, the works of art that you see today on the walls of American museums in particular came here in a perfectly legal and reasonable manner. Often, of course, this was before or between the 2 world wars. So I'm just showing you this as a kind of a curious and rather interesting example, not a particularly important or distinguished painting, but historically interesting. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention when I began. Let's all do cell phone turn off. If you haven't already, let's maybe do that. In any event, this is a painting that is more historically important than it is aesthetically profound. It is by a rather minor British artist, and it represents the interior of the Grafton Galleries in Mayfair in London at the exhibition that was organized by Roger Fry in 1913, having to do with, well, as he called it, Cézanne, Gauguin, and the post-impressionists. It was really only the first or second time that the British public had had an opportunity to see artists such as this. So the artist who painted this particular painting is standing up above. You see, here's the upper level looking down, and there are various artists that are taking notes and doing this, that, and the other. People in the gallery. That happens to be Walter Sickert, we know from all of his red hair and beard and so forth. And on the wall we see 3 paintings by Gauguin. This now in the Courtauld, this in the National Gallery in Edinburgh, and then the one in the middle is, of course, this painting, which is in the Norton Museum of Art over on Dixie Highway. So there's a painting that had left France long before World War II broke out. Perfectly safe and sound. It was already in England, eventually came to America, had one owner before it was purchased by Ralph Norton. But that's an example of the kind of painting that the Nazis certainly would have got rid of, because Gauguin, Van Gogh, amongst the post-impressionists, and then all the artists of the younger generation that we call Cubists, Picasso, Vlaminck, Derain, Braque, all of those, the Fauve artists, Matisse, and so forth, all of those were of very, very little interest to the Nazis and were amongst the artists whose works were purged from their museums in the middle of the 1930s, before the war actually broke out. Now, artists such as those I just mentioned, plus many, many, many German artists who worked in a style or represented subjects that were not thought to be wholesome and sufficiently Aryan, were declared or described as being entartete, which means simply degenerate. So starting in 1936 and then culminating in 1937, the Nazis organized the first of several exhibitions of what they simply called entartete Kunst. So here we have, then the sign simply says an Ausstellung of entartete Kunst, and the entrance is free. It's an exhibition of degenerate art, entrance free. Well, it wasn't exactly quite so sanitary, meaning that many, many people in many neighborhoods in German cities were more than just a little encouraged to go. It was something that was thought to be edifying for them to come along and to look at all of this degenerate art that, thanks to their government, was going to be purged from German museums in order to purify them. That was really the intention. And some of you, no doubt, have seen images such as this. When this exhibition opened, first of all in Munich in 1937, and then it toured to 11 other German cities, more or less intact, but you can imagine that it grew as it went along. As more and more works of art were confiscated, they were shoved into these exhibitions and hung rather haphazardly, but in the normal fashion of an art exhibition. But what's unique about this, I don't know how many of you can read any of this German. This is actually from an art manifesto that was called Aktion, that was written in 1915 by an artist whom the Nazis thought of as, well, they weren't quite sure. Later on they called him a Bolshevik, but at this point they just called him insane. The fact that and there were terms that were more or less interchangeable, Jewish, Bolshevik, communist, degenerate, and insane all seemed to work. That was any one of those things with which you could be labeled, that was good enough to have your art taken off the walls and expelled from these museums. So this is a slogan written by that artist himself, and it's the kind of thing which the Nazi propagandists, headed by Goebbels, of course, Himmler and Goebbels, used to disparage and to discredit the artists who were not of interest to them. So, well, who did that include? Oh, there's a rather famous photograph, of course, of Hitler and Goebbels seeming very happy, very pleased with himself, and so forth, visiting one of these exhibitions, and why they were interested in so-called purging their collections was not really, the motives were multiple, but one of them was that they wanted simply to sell the art off or to exchange it, usually in Switzerland, for works of art that were on their shopping lists. You may know that from long before the beginning of the war, Hitler had already planned with Albert Speer to build a great museum in the city of Linz in Austria, where he came from. That was going to be, in essence, a museum of the art of all mankind as seen through the Nazi eyes. And so there was a very distinct hierarchy of artists who were incredibly wanted by the Nazi hierarchy and collectors, primarily Hitler, then also Goering, but then many others who became art collectors as well. And they wanted to populate this building, this fantastic building that was going to be created in Linz, with what they considered the finest of Aryan art. Well, they wanted to repatriate a lot of the German art, of course, that had already gone to places like the Louvre and the National Gallery, London, or even to America. In some cases already, the Metropolitan and the National Gallery, Philadelphia, Detroit, there were German and then Dutch paintings as well, which were considered by the Nazis to be theirs, or to be of their sort of racial heritage. I suppose most of you know, if not all, that the Netherlands or Dutch artists, and indeed the Dutch race, were made honorary Aryans, quote unquote. And therefore Rembrandt and Vermeer in particular were right at the top of the list with the three German artists whom they coveted most egregiously or most greedily, who of course were Albrecht Dürer, Hans Wollner-Grün, Cranach, and then Holbein is pretty near the top as well, followed by Rembrandt and Vermeer. So, in other words, a lot of this degenerate art, here's, for example, one of Van Gogh's many self-portraits, today in the Fogg Museum at Harvard University. These things were taken not because the Nazis wanted them, they didn't, but they knew that Americans and South Americans and other people did, so they were taken for the purpose of selling them. So what's going on here is a very famous auction at the Fischer Gallery in Lucerne in Switzerland in 1937. So you see, we're still more than 2 years away from the official outbreak of the war. In 1938 would come the Anschluss of Germany with Austria, then there would be the occupation of the Sudetenland, then Kristallnacht in November, then finally in the spring of 1939, the full invasion and occupation of Czechoslovakia, and finally on September 1st, 1939, the bombing of Poland. So this was happening before all of those events actually had taken place. Many hundreds of paintings were sold, and these kinds of auctions were held in rather rapid succession. So the point being that no one, or at least they did not care about Van Gogh because they wanted those other artists, so these things were being taken, confiscated, and pillaged from families, but also then from those German museums in order to amass the funds required to buy the works by the artists that they really treasured. Therefore, German museums lost virtually all of their holdings of native artists, artists such as Nolde. This is Emil Nolde's famous depiction of masks, which is in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. And then this is a sculpture by Wilhelm Lembruck, a young man who committed suicide actually at the end of World War I, but whose works had already begun to enter German collections by the time of the Nazi the rise to power of the Nazis in the 1930s. And he was considered degenerate, and so virtually everything by him was expelled from German collections. This too is over on Dixie Highway in the Norton Museum, if you want to have a look at it. On view the last time I was there, I'm not sure if it is today. But those things were, in our eyes and in the eyes of the rest of the world, those things were legally acquired because the German government had officially sold them. They weren't looted from anybody, they weren't taken from anybody, and they weren't taken from those museums, they were de-accessioned. They were gotten rid of. So that process was fine. So we're not talking about that universe of works when it comes to the problem of restitution. Now, more complicated then would be Picasso, because his primary dealer in the 1930s was a man called Paul Rosenberg, whose father, brother had been established in Paris for a long time, and he was the principal dealer, not just for Picasso and Braque, with whom he had separate contracts, but also with numerous other artists of that era. His gallery in the Rue de la Boété contained fantastic works by other artists, such as Leger, and even younger artists that were more controversial, people like Duchamp. Certainly the futurist Severini and so forth. You found all of these in his very, very elegant gallery, from which he did a great business all during the 20s and 30s. This came to a screeching halt then, of course, in the spring of 1940. He had just managed to get his family via Lisbon to New York City, where they had managed to reconstitute at least part of the holdings of their gallery, because there was at the time of the outbreak of World War II a huge Picasso show that was actually going around America. There was one in London at the time, so he had about 300 works by these artists that were not in France. So he was able to get his business going again in New York City, and there they maintained themselves even into this day on East 71st Street through subsequent generations. But this is one of the paintings that was, that was in Rosenberg's stock at the time of the outbreak of hostilities. You know, the French resistance didn't last long. I mean, the invasion, the German invasion of France happened at the very end of April, early May of 1540. By June 18th, it was all over. And the Vichy government was established and put in place. And so then life, we wouldn't dare to say that life went on, quote, as normal, but many people were able to resume business and to carry on with a lot of the things that they had done before the German occupation. Well, not so for art dealers, especially for Jewish art dealers, and especially for art dealers who happened to be Jewish, who carried works by artists thought to be degenerate. That was the nasty combination, you know, of all. So of course they were targeted. And Rosenberg was one of those who, amongst the greatest, and so he was one of the first whose property, personal and professional, was seized. He tried to move a great deal of his stock to a town called Libourne, which is not far from Bordeaux, where he stored things in a bank vault and encouraged Matisse, in fact arranged for Matisse to have a vault in the same bank where Matisse sent a lot of works. Matisse and Braque made it through the war fairly well, living in France, because they were both Gentiles. Picasso still had a Spanish passport, and so let's say their standing was somewhat more ambiguous than that of their dealer, Monsieur Rosenberg, whose standing was not in the slightest bit ambiguous. If the Nazis had been able to seize him, they would have done so. But he was safely in New York at the time. His stock, however, was taken and stored like hundreds, if not thousands, of other paintings that came from the stock of Jewish art dealers at the Jeu de Paume in Paris. That was the main gathering point, and it eventually became the great sort of shopping point, the great Costco of Nazi-seized art, where whenever Goering came to town, these very elaborately, carefully orchestrated visits for Goering to come to Paris, specifically to go and quote-unquote shop at the Jeu de Paume. And he never paid for anything. He always arranged barters. He always arranged trades with dealers, mostly Swiss, sometimes American, who wanted the works of art that had been confiscated from both private and public sources in France. Goering didn't pay money, he exchanged artworks. But in doing so, he amassed a great collection, most of which was housed at the villa outside Berlin called Karinthal, built in memory of his Swedish wife. And after the, let's say, the end of the war in the 1940s, when things got desperate for the Nazi hierarchy and their leaders, everything out of Karinthal, like most of the things that had belonged to Berlin, and had belonged to Hitler and others, were transferred to the salt mines in western Austria near a place called Alzey. And that is where, after the war, then they were discovered by the Western Allied troops, by Eisenhower's army, moving from west to east and to south. And so thousands of objects were recovered thanks to the advance of Americans across Europe in that direction, because they had been carefully stored and preserved in these underground mines, and because the Nazis were the most meticulous catalogers and record makers in the history of mankind. You know, it's better than what you find in ancient Egyptian tombs, where usually you have a list of all the things that are going along with the pharaoh to the next world. The records that the Nazis created and kept were meticulous, so it wasn't hard to find out where the greatest of the works of art went. The Rothschild collection, the David Weil collection, the Alphonse Kahn collection, most of these things were returned to Paris rather quickly after the war, because they'd all been so meticulously cataloged and packed and stored, and either were found there or had already gone to Berlin. In any event, that's slightly a digression, sorry. In the case of this Picasso painting, like many, many other Picasso paintings that belong to Paul Rosenberg and had been sort of sequestered away in this bank vault in Libourne, it took quite some time for the Nazi officials to find out where these things were. They eventually did, and eventually then the Rosenberg property was seized. But Monsieur Braque, being an Aryan working in Paris, put up a stink, and went along and said, no, remember now, some of those are mine, and here I am, and I'm claiming those back. Well, he didn't take just his own paintings, he took a number of Picasso's as well, one of which was this picture. It had been, like all the rest of them, not cut out of a frame, but detached and rolled up and put into tubes. So you can see when you're standing in front of it that there are these horizontal parallel lines that go all the way across. Can't be helped. It's the result in this case of the canvas having been rolled from end to end, and thus it was returned via Brock to the Rosenbergs in New York, where it was sold to Ralph Norton, and you can also see that over on Dixie Highway. An example of a painting that got away, in other words. Other times, paintings that were seized were returned to their owners after the war. Here's a Ferdinand Boll, a picture that had belonged to a man called Marcel Wolff, lived in The Hague before the war. He and his brother both managed to escape and live out the war in Switzerland, though most of their family went to the camps. Their paintings were entirely confiscated because there were so many wonderful Dutch and Flemish paintings like this Boll, and Goering wanted most of them for himself. If you have never seen the kinds of inventory scheme that you find on the back of paintings like this, which have retained their original frames, or sometimes the stretchers, or both, I can show it to you now. We're going to be looking at a little detail of the numbering systems, but it has to do with those. One on the stretcher and one on the frame. And there it is, standing for Nederlandische Kunstsammlungen. So in other words, of the Dutch art collections, of the things that had been taken from Amsterdam. Oops, I've got the wrong. I think I'm missing one. On another one, in a circle, there's a Roman numeral 2, and that means that it came from The Hague. The cities in the Netherlands were numbered with Roman numerals according to the order in which the trains left heading to Germany. So Roman numeral 1 is Amsterdam, Roman numeral 2 is The Hague. So when these things came back at the end of the war, there it is, NK1453. Well, you look it up in the cross index, the kind of the concordance of the inventories, that meant that it belonged to Marcel Wolff in The Hague, and he got everything back. And then legally, quite legally, sent it all to auction 10 years after that, at the end of his life, in London, where that particular painting was bought by George and Valerie Delacourt. And so it too, that painting, is also at the Norton Museum of Art, and an example of one of those kinds of things that, that came back to people legally. But you know, you might say, and we have to always remember that the great majority of the important artworks that were taken by the Nazis from the Low Countries and from France, the great majority were in fact recovered and returned. That meant there were still thousands and thousands, if not tens of thousands of things that never were accounted for, that went missing because they had been taken from a town or from a family, from a dealer whose stock wasn't so valued by the Nazis, and therefore no one went to the time and trouble to make that kind of a meticulous inventory of it. Things were of course scattered like flotsam and jetsam all through the countries of Western Europe, as eventually the German armies retreated from west to east. Whole boxcars were abandoned. Sometimes there were trains that were seized, and there might be one car on the train that had paintings, whereas every other car on the train was filled with furniture and silver and Judaica and clothes and just endless numbers of items. And any of you who have read the book or seen the DVD called The Rape of Europa will be aware of the quantity, the sort of staggering quantity of material that was taken. And of course, for most of that material, there wasn't anybody to give it back to. The families had been decimated. They were gone. Many of them, of course, had moved to America, Canada, South America, but many thousands and thousands, of course, had died in the camps. So there wasn't always someone to whom to give it back. There began then the almost, sometimes impossible process of trying to identify previous owners, rival claimants, and so forth. That's where we get to the whole story of restitution. What does that mean? I mean, it means that the process that works in both directions. whereby the owners of an artwork today actively look for the previous owner, a claimant, someone whose family might have had the work of art prior to the Nazi era, prior to 1933-45, or it might be a process that goes on in the other direction, whereby the claimant tries to pursue it. In both directions, there are pitfalls and problems to be encountered. For objects that are in art museums, there are the usual, I just refer to them as kind of the bureaucratic delays of processing. In the days before computers in particular, when everything was done in a much, in a much slower manner. From the private individual, the claimant's point of view or perspective, they haven't any idea where to go to start looking, because there never was any kind of a central gathering point for that kind of information until the late 1990s, and here in this country, the establishment of something called the Nazi-Era Provenance Index Portal, NEPIP. And if you want to look that up, you can do so. Just put that NEPIP uppercase, in your search bar, and it'll start to move. You'll begin to get pages, and it's fairly explanatory, but it is long. But it helps you go and look through not full inventories, but look through lists that museums have created over the last 12 or 13 years of objects in their collections, in their possession, which are known to have been in Western Europe during those 12 years of the Nazi regime, 33 to 45, and which are known to have traded hands, and which are known to have gaps in their provenance. So those are the things that the searcher is looking for, whereas the museum person or the private investigator or the lawyer is trying to go the other direction. Is trying to find out whether there are any heirs or any survivors who can lay claim to these things. And that's a project that at the Norton Museum really didn't get going until the early 2000s, simply because there weren't staff members in order to do it. One person who helped hugely with that is Lisa Hurd. Raise your hand. Who's sitting here in the audience today, who had a great hand in the first sort of wave, the big push of trying to get material at the Norton, both researched sufficiently well so that it could be put up on this portal, Nazi-Era Provenance Information Portal. Now, in some instances, of course, people have been successful. And I think you can tell, because you probably can tell what the image is behind this woman, that I'm going to talk very briefly about this, because it illustrates one of the really difficult, perhaps the most trenchant problem that claimants face today when they're trying to both find and identify, and then recover artworks that they know belonged to their families before the war. This beautiful, beautiful lady is Mariah Altman. She died about 2 years ago next month, I guess, something like that, at the age of 98. But she had spent a great deal of her life, at least in the last 20 or 30 years, trying to recover this painting, which of course is one of Gustav Klimt's great masterpieces. This is a portrait of Mariah's aunt, Adele Bauer-Bloch. They were residents of Vienna before the war, and although certain members of the family died on the eve of the war, including Adele Bauer-Bloch, the collection itself was put up at auction under circumstances that were certainly not voluntary. In other words, I mean, they had to surrender the collection in order that the government, the Austrian, now Nazi government, might be able to sell it off. Well, they did some of those, they sold some of the things and they kept some things. And the things that were kept, they put into one of their museums in Austria, where many of you no doubt have visited, called the Belvedere, which is on the outskirts, a very beautiful neoclassical palace that was used by the emperors of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for 2 centuries for many things. But one of the things that happens there is on every New Year's Eve, that's where they do that New Year's from Vienna concert, with Julie Andrews walking around and that sort of thing, a bit surreal. But that's where the the Bauer block paintings actually came to be housed, because there is a great art collection that is shown there. So the problem then in getting these back was because Mrs. Altman and her family, of course, had been living in California for a long time, and her children and grandchildren were all American citizens. And so the first problem was simply establishing standing in someone's court, simply getting yourself recognized by a United States court and an Austrian court, so that there could be a legal inquiry and a contest over who actually owns these things. Well, that takes years and a fortune. And if you don't have somebody bankrolling it for you, it's going to be very, very difficult to make much progress. Well, in this case, the very willing bankroller who made this possible for Mrs. Altman and her family to recover those pictures, there were 7 Klimts alone, plus some other things, was Ronald Lauder, as in the cosmetics family. And therefore, after the whole thing was settled and they were put up at auction, it was he who was able to buy this and 2 or 3 others. Therefore, thanks to him, it's available to all of us today at the Neue Gallery in New York City. You've probably been, some of you have been to the, yeah, a lot of you have been there. So, you know, that's where she lives, along with other Klimt paintings and many other pictures from the Lauder collection representing Neue Sachlichkeit and realism of the late 19th century, but mostly of the first decades of the 20th century. So this was one of those problems. It wasn't that it was not known where the paintings were. It was perfectly well known where the paintings were. They were on public view in the Belvedere. That wasn't the issue. The issue was trying to get a post-war Austrian government to be willing to hear a claimant's just protest against that ownership. Much of this couldn't have happened except for 3 things. And I suppose if you're interested in the subject and you want to think about why this all took place at the end of the 20th century and is now moving forward in the 20th century, which concerns me and lots of other people, there were 3 things. One is the fact that the American army has recovered all of those records. Had they been all destroyed, it would have only taken 1 or 2 grenades, or something like that. But they were, of course, buried in the salt mines near Alsace. And once the retreat back into Germany and so forth began, they weren't staying around. Nobody was going to bother about the works of art. They were simply left there. And buried with them then were those inventories. Well, those inventories happen to be then in our National Archives. There are now copies of them that have been made available to other people. But they are at College Park, Maryland, and that's where the main house of the United States National Archives for treaties, war documents, maps, all of those sorts of things. They're not in downtown Washington anymore. They're out there in the new facility. Anyway, the existence of those things in Washington, D.C., the widespread adoption of the internet, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And those things all happened about 1990. That was 89, 90, when really internet, I remember in the early 1980s, I didn't have a computer. I don't think I got a laptop computer until about 1986 or 7 or something like that. So it really was in 89, 90, around in there when everybody began to get them and this information could be shared. And then the fall of the Berlin Wall, which meant not just that we could physically go to Prague and Berlin and even Minsk, and places like that. We could go and consult the archives, but it meant that those people in those places could communicate freely with us in a way they hadn't ever been able to do. So that's why the whole restitution, the whole provenance research and a bandwagon and the restitution of artworks got underway in a big way in the 1990s. This was further stimulated by a resolution of the Association of American Museum Directors in 1998, which called upon all the institutions of all represented by the directors who belonged to that body, that they would engage actively in provenance research. This is something that people didn't do very much before that time. You did it, but it was an afterthought. It was the last thing you did. It wasn't the first thing you did. And it didn't have its own sort of separate library or archive, that kind of thing, within any kind of a museum setting. After 1998, it became a priority. Therefore, people were collecting, saving the documents, disseminating them thanks to the internet, and so forth and so on. It's in part why this story of Mrs. Altman had a good outcome. There are other people. Hang on just a second. Thank you. There are other people who have had partial success. One of the most interesting and conspicuous cases is that of the man called Jacques Houtstikker, the Dutch Jewish dealer who died quite young at the age of 42. Here he is examining in his gallery before the war, examining a painting. He, his wife, and infant son were literally about 2.5 miles ahead of the Nazi tanks. And they managed to get to the port in Holland and on a boat, a freighter that was on its way not to Calais, that would have been of no good, would not have helped, but instead was going over to Dover. It in fact landed at Folkestone. In the crossing in the middle of the night, Houtstikker went up on deck and fell through an open trap and essentially fell 4 stories and broke his neck and died instantly. And they didn't find him until the next day. His widow and baby were therefore kind of stuck because she was Austrian. She was an Austrian Jew, a very famous opera singer, but because she was Austrian, she was considered an enemy alien. Therefore, she was not allowed off the boat in order to go to London, where she had bank accounts and relatives waiting for her. She had to stay on the ship. They stopped near Southampton, where this man's body was actually interred on the very near the seashore. She was not allowed off the boat. So the body was removed, and she had to sail on to America, in fact. And she and her son, infant son, both became American citizens, and she remarried, so that her name was Van Saar. The point of all of this is that immediately after the German occupation of Amsterdam, one of the first ports of call for Goering, whom you see here, was the Houtstikker Gallery. Here's the name. It's G-O-U-D-S-T-I-K-K-E-R. It means goldsmith. A Houtstikker, a goldschmidt, and, you know. So that's the name, and there's Goering, who came in and chose what he wanted. They took 1,400 artworks, and then it wasn't really until the 1990s that this lady, who is Jacques Houtstikker's daughter-in-law, in other words, she was the wife of that infant baby who went across the Atlantic in June of 1940. It wasn't until this lady, whose name is Marie van Saar, began her extraordinary quest to try to recover at least some of the possessions of the family. It was perfectly well known what had been there, because all throughout his career, Mr. Houtstikker had kept this book. And this is one volume of 4, which, as you can see, the names of the artists and the description of the painting and the dimensions and so forth are very meticulously typed. They are, and bibliographies as well, at least in part. And you can see we happen to be open to the page that talks about Salomon van Ruysdael. So here are different Ruysdael paintings that were in his stock, with bibliography and past ownership and all of that sort of thing. So that existed, and it's still in the library, one of the libraries in the Hague today. And it was known, you know, it was always known that it was there, but it took 50 years for someone like Marie van Saar to finally get kind of the financing and the intellectual capability, meaning she had to hire scholars and curators to help her. She had to get lawyers who would fight the case for her. Again, it was hard to get standing in the Netherlands to do so. But eventually, but to this day, she's recovered about 300 of the 1,400 that went missing. It is known perfectly well where many, many others are. She has a partial catalog at any rate. They range from Buenos Aires to Moscow, and from Stockholm to Messina. You know, they're all over Europe, but not very many in America, except a few that are in museum collections legally. Now, once she had recovered some of these things, you know, she had huge numbers of bills to pay, having hired all these lawyers and things. And it's not at all unusual or surprising that if people are successful in their claim of restitution, that they sell some things that, that represented their family's heritage that had been lost, and many of them are trying to recover some financial wherewithal in order to support not only the living but also future generations. So here are just 2 or 3 of the paintings that Mariah Fonsar has sold. This is one of those Salomon Roysdales that was listed on those pages you saw just a moment ago. And this great masterpiece from 1642, and I'm happy to say this has gone to our National Gallery in Washington. This painting, rather unusual historical scene by Jan Steen, one of the precursors, one of the great contemporaries of Rembrandt, who painted mostly interiors. In this case, it's a religious subject. Oh no, it's the classical version. This is the Sacrifice of Iphigenia, and that belongs now to a new owner in New York City. And then here's a great Bellotto of the Grand Canal, which I don't think has yet been purchased, but will wind up in a few weeks' time in the Getty Museum. So again, a picture that will be on public view and something that all of us can see. She hasn't had success in every case, and I think it's only fair that I mention that as well. Not everybody wins. Not only are there people, some of whom live here in our region, who've tried for years and years and years to establish standing in the courts, but have been unable to do so. There are also instances about which we could talk. This is simply one wherein the museum itself has stonewalled, has not cooperated, but has very sort of deliberately kind of swum against the tide, as it were, or has not been willing to assist in returning the objects, even though everybody knows where they came from. Here's a great pair of paintings by Cranach the Elder, of course representing Adam and Eve, exactly the kind of thing that Goering wanted most. So they were amongst the prizes that were stolen from the Houtsticker Gallery. They hang today at the Norton Simon Museum. Not the Norton on Dixie, the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena, which, sort of plays by its own rules. It's not a public museum in the sense that it's not the city of Philadelphia or Detroit or something like that. It's the Norton Simon Foundation, and they sort of do what they want. And in this case, they simply have stood on the expiration, according to the statute of limitations in the state of California, by which they claim, therefore, that she was much too late in making any claim for these paintings, and that after a certain point, then it just expires and you're out of luck. So they still hang there on the wall at the Norton Simon. Not a word mentioned on the label or in any catalog about their provenance, which I think is interesting. And finally, I want to tell you about just one thing that is still going on today. There are numerous such cases, but this one happens to strike rather close to home, meaning Florida. In the late summer of 2011, meaning just finished, just this past year, there was an exhibition at the Mary Brogan Museum of Arts and Sciences up in Tallahassee of 75 Renaissance and Baroque Lombard paintings from the Brera Museum, which is the principal museum of the city of Milan. Now, how those paintings came to go to the Mary Brogan Museum in Tallahassee, you tell me if you know. But that's not the point. I mean, it was a fabulously interesting exhibition for anybody like myself who wants to look at those kinds of things. They are by artists whose names are not household ones. 16th century, so it's the age of Titian and Veronese and so forth and so on, but the artists working in Milan are not so well known. Nonetheless, there it is, show in Tallahassee. One of the paintings included was this rather strange, rather remarkable, often thought to be a very beautiful picture by an artist called Girolamo Romanino, who was a contemporary of Titian. This painting representing Christ carrying the cross on the way to Calvary, executed about 1535. As you can see, it is mostly a portrait of a sleeve of this gigantic and beautifully painted and very alluring salmon-colored satin sleeve, which is part of Christ's robe and seems unlikely to me, but hey, I wasn't there. Whatever. And this is a painting that is not as big as that image, but not much smaller on the other hand, about 4 by 3 feet, that sort of thing. But in any event, anybody who's known about this painting for 20 years, as I have, knows that it comes from the expatriate Italian Jewish family with the ironic name of Giuseppe dei Gentili. But that happens to be their surname. All of that, Giuseppe dei Gentili, Joseph of the Gentiles, all of that is their surname. But they had lived in Paris long before World War II, and the principal, the father, who died literally on the outbreak of World War II, was famous in Paris. He led to many, many exhibitions. His collection had been formed in Italy, but before he then transferred his business and life and everything to Paris. It was one of those that was confiscated almost immediately by the Nazis when they entered Paris. And, you know, I thought the Italians were their allies, but that didn't spare him. The fact that he was Jewish trumped everything else. And the painting and the collection had many old master paintings that were very desirable. So the whole thing was taken and there was a forced auction. The pictures were largely scattered all over Europe and they pop up here and there. But anyone familiar with the collection knows that it had been sold under duress, and therefore it seemed strange to many of us familiar with the history of that family that this painting was purchased as late as 1998 by the Brera Museum in Milan. I mean, had they cared to know better, they could have known better. If they wanted to explore it just a little bit further, because most people knew where this picture had come from. So the thing they should not have done was send it to Florida. Because, of course, once it's no longer in your country, you have very little control over it. So last November, on Halloween Day, that was the last day of the exhibition, up in Tallahassee. There it is hanging as it was hanging on the wall. But on the very last day, this is what happened to it. Someone, not me, had tipped off Homeland Security that the painting that was hanging on the wall and had been there all summer up in Tallahassee was in fact from the Giuseppe dei Gentili family, and therefore it probably had been taken from them in Paris in 1940. Well, in fact, that's the case, and a very quiet suit was made, and so the painting was seized on the very last day of that exhibition. And I got a call maybe 10 days later from someone down in Fort Lauderdale who explained that he needed to have it officially appraised. I mean, that the government needed the picture to go through the process of an appraisal, because it was, of course, going to then enter into the juggernaut and the long, dark sinkhole of federal litigation. You know, I mean, God knows when we'll ever see this painting again, or if the family will ever get it, although they deserve it. I mean, it really is one of those things that should go back to them, but that will take a while. But I'm not a licensed appraiser, and so I called upon a friend of mine, Henry Gardner, who is to go. Is Henry here today? There's Henry Gardner, yes, sitting here in the back. So Henry very kindly went to have a look at the picture and to provide the government with an official appraisal to get that process kind of started. So of course, you know, to them, I mean, to the people who work at Homeland Security, or in this case for an NGO that contractually handles a lot of that kind of work, it's just another thing. I mean, it could have been an old automobile, I suppose, or it could have been, you know, it's an Italian painting, it's a this, it's a that, because it's just property that they need to move along. But eventually, this will get solved. So if you're interested in reading any more of the contemporaneous newspaper articles or accounts of it, you'll find them if you just put that name, if you put that artist's name in the search bar probably, and it's Romanino. R-O-M-A-N-I-N-O. Roman with an I-N-O on it. Like calling somebody Fiorentino or Veneziano or, you know, Pillsbury. You just call Romanino. If you put that in your search bar, you'll pull up a few of these little articles, which are more or less accurate. Reporters seem to have a very difficult time getting the names right, getting the dates right. They misreport prices and evaluations wildly, so that just happens.
Is there anyone from that family?
Oh yes, the family. These people are very much alive, and I'm sure the tip-off came from one of them. You know, I mean, it did, like I say, it didn't come from me. I knew the painting was in Tallahassee, but you know, I got enough trouble. And I didn't want to get involved in it, but I mean, I thought, well, somehow or another, and I did not. It puzzled me that the Italian authorities sent it to America. That seemed to me to be the strange part. But once it's there, you know, I'm not going to interfere there. But nonetheless, so that's one of these many stories that is still ongoing, yet to be resolved, and involves people that you know. Thank you very much for coming today.